Hi everybody, it's Wednesday. I thought this week I would take a break from our regularly scheduled sort of book review and spend a little bit of time talking to you today about the changes with recommendations that the CDC has granted at this point for those who are vaccinated. And I'll address that first and then talk a little bit about for those of you that are not vaccinated. But basically what they are saying is that if you are vaccinated, your risk for having any major problems being around other vaccinated people of either spreading or contracting the disease is significantly lower. What we know is that people who have been vaccinated and fully vaccinated, meaning at least 2 weeks out from their second vaccine or 6 weeks out, let's just say from the J&J vaccine, that less than one COVID hospitalization for every 144,000 vaccinated people, and deaths for vaccinated patients is 1 in 635,000. So those are significantly reduced in vaccinated patients. But where did all this come from and what does it really mean at the end of the day? Well, you kind of have to understand what viral load is and how these PCR tests are done. And this is mostly coming from a study. These recommendations are coming from a study that was done in Israel that was released in March. And this study looked at over 4,000 people in Israel who had been vaccinated, ranging in age from 16 to 89. And most of the people that they looked at were between 40 and 60. And they looked each week, they were testing these people for virus. And they test using a test called the PCR, which we've heard about, the polymerase chain reaction test. And the way this test works is that the sample is put in a machine, and depending on how many cycles it has to run, or what we call cycle threshold, to get a positive. So the sooner that test turns positive, the idea is that there's a really high viral load. And if you cycle more and more and more and more and further out and further out and further out, that the viral load, if it tests positive, is significantly lower because it takes a lot longer to see that. Just like if you were pregnant, say at 6 weeks, it might take longer to see that test turn positive rather than if you were pregnant at 8 months, which visually you can see, but in the test it would turn positive right off the bat, because we know that that's a big discrepancy between early pregnancy and late pregnancy as far as how these tests can go. So what we see then is that in patients who have been vaccinated, we see a very high cycle threshold, meaning that if they test positive, it's very low viral load. And what do we know about viral load? It's very low viral load is less likely to be infectious. Now, in vaccinated patients, that's great because we know that they're not likely to spread disease, although possible, and we can see that. I mean, we see people who have recently tested positive even in the sports world because these folks are being tested all the time and they're fully vaccinated. And yet, it's very unlikely that they themselves are that infectious. Just like people who exercise a lot, get plenty of sleep, and who are eating well and don't have hypertension and no diabetes and have a healthy weight, when they become infected, they tend to have lower viral loads as well. So when you also test patients who've not been vaccinated and they test positive but are asymptomatic, it is very likely that they too have a very low viral load and are less likely to be infectious. And So it would be nice to have some studies to report on patients who are asymptomatic and who have tested positive for antibodies, and to understand perhaps if we could test these patients and have that information. So I think at the end of the day, what will really be helpful is to understand the cycle threshold and what we're seeing in patients, because when you look at the literature on patients with significant comorbidities, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, we see that these patients tend to have a very low cycle threshold, meaning a very high amount of viral load, because their immune systems tend not to be able to handle the initial assault when they become infected. So it's likely that it would be very helpful when patients are being tested to know exactly what is that cycle threshold when you're being tested. And ultimately, that may be something that's quite beneficial in the real world of understanding how we can continue to move forward and release a lot of the confinements that we've been having to live under with COVID in terms of mask wearing and social distancing, etc., so that if we can get more factual information about spread of the disease and if these viral loads actually have predictive value, this would be a great thing. But as far as we know with the vaccines, we are definitely seeing reduced numbers of infections as well as reduced hospitalizations, and even though possible, very little in terms of morbidity and mortality with patients who have been vaccinated at this point. So just hopefully that's given you some information and some clarity. I think we will still continue to learn more as we go along. There are still a lot of unanswered questions regarding need for boosters, etc., and that may honestly be quite variable. But it is my hope that with these tests in the future, we will actually get some idea of when patients are testing positive, is there a high viral load, is there a low viral load, so that these quarantining times and when people become asymptomatic, can they return to normal activities? All of these things go into play, and I think we still have a lot of things to learn. So I'm hopeful that that has been somewhat helpful for you, and we'll continue to watch this and see how things begin to open up, and hopefully we will still be able to keep the mortality and morbidity of this virus to a low degree as we have as time has gone along. And Texas has done quite well recently, so hopefully we will continue in that vein. Have a great week, everybody. Talk to you next week.